Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillahi wa kafa, salatu wassalamu ala man la nabiyya ba'da wa ba'd. Alhamdulillah, we are hoping to make it today from 966 to 1099AH. That's covering a lot of ground in a short period of time because the historical events start to multiply by leaps and bounds. If we think that we've covered a lot of material, a lot of things have happened, it's going to start to become more so in these classes. Now we're starting from 966 to 986. There was huge flooding in Hadramaut in Yemen in 970 AH, and it destroyed numerous homes, and many people were made homeless. In the year 971 AH, there was also a huge flood in Mecca, so much so that the Yemeni corner of the Kaaba was actually drenched, and many of the people died. So there was sort of a small, almost tsunami-type wave, and it killed some of the people that were in the masjid during that time. In 918 AH, and I just wanted to mention about these two because they're significant, these events, before we delve too deeply into the other things. They're significant and they're important. Now, it's listed as 918, but actually, I wanted to sort of run back through who the Khulafa were very quickly before we came to the current Khalifa. Now, in 918, this brought the death of the first Khan, or Khan the First. He was the 8th Ottoman Khalifa. This in turn brought to power another Khalifa. Salim the First was in power as the 9th Khalifa, and the 8th Khalifa was Bayazid. Bayazid came to power after the death of Muhammad al-Fatih, who was also known as Muhammad II or Muhammad al-Thani. He'd sent out the Ottoman Navy to save the lives of Muslims and Jews under the Reconquista of Spain and offered them safe passage to Ottoman government. He used to openly mock the Spanish monarchs for kicking out their intelligentsia, while his own infrastructure was built up by Jewish, Muslim, and Aryan subjects in his empire. Now, this is particularly significant because the fact of Bayazid, the reason why Bayazid was so significant is because he accepted all of the intelligentsia of the Jews, of the Christians who happened to be Aryans in their theology. We discussed Aryan theology before. He accepted them without putting any preconditions. And these noblemen and nobles happened to be the courtesans, the high-level people of his society. And it's the same thing that happens when people become Muslim. In general, when people convert to Islam in these societies, it tends to be the intelligentsia. Muslims don't get as much junk as what the kuffar get from us when one of ours apostates. So when you look at the Muslims that have gone over to atheism or what have you and apostated, most of them are our junk, our garbage. But when you look at the people that have become Muslim, the great bulk of them are their intelligentsia. They're doctors, they're scientists, they're scholars, they're philosophers. I mean, looking at Muhammad Marmaduke Pickthall, that was a major blow for him to convert to Islam. Muhammad Marmaduke Pickthall was a lord. He was in the House of Lords. That was a massive blow. To have him come back after having studied for years away, dressed as a Muslim, and enter into the House of Lords and invite all of the honored gentlemen to Islam. That's shocking for them, right? That's what happens. So Bayazid was bringing in people and building up this huge infrastructure. So the Jewish golden age that had been in Andalus, as Andalus was crumbling and cracking, you started to find that golden age transferring into North Africa. If you look at most of the scholarly resources of the Jews from the Middle Ages, after Andalus, which they're calling Spain. After that period, the most influential literature for Jews is coming from North Africa. Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, known as Rambam, it was based in Egypt. One of his descendants was a doctor to Salah ad-Din. Rambam and Moshe, there was another Rabbi Nachmanides, or Rabbi Nachman. All of these different people were either North Africans or pulling from North African sources. Good bulk of them. The Arian Christians, Arius himself was a Berber. Arius himself was a Berber. And so all of this is coming back into North Africa. The Ottomans have taken North Africa, and all of that knowledge and breadth and scholarship is coming into them. And he's using that to build up palaces, masjids, refurbishing hospitals, and the Western world in Europe begins to decay. And this is what happened. Now in 974 AH, you look at the next Khalifa that came after Salim I. Salim I was the 9th Khalifa. The 10th Khalifa was Sulaiman Khan ibn Salim Khan, the 10th Ottoman Khalifa. He had been given the Khilafah in the year 926 AH after the death of his father, Sultan Salim Khan. Sultan Sulaiman was also known as Sulaiman al-Awwal, or Sulaiman the Magnificent, Sulaiman the Lawgiver, Sulaiman al-Qanuni, the Lawgiver. He was the longest reigning of the Ottomans, ruling for a fantastic 46 years. There have been studies written by kuffar, not Muslims. Put the Muslims out of the equation for a second. Kuffar have written multi-volume studies on Sulaiman al-Awwal's administration because of how successful he was. Let's just talk about him very briefly, what he did. I had mentioned before that Columbus and other explorers were sent out not for finding new places and bringing back good things and giving glad tidings to people. They were sent out to find alternative trade routes so they did not have to trade with Muslims. Number two, they were trying to corner the market on any spices or new natural resources that they found. They began to build up their fleets, and they started to build up a huge maritime industry. When they started spreading eastward to try to take over India and other places, and Frankish pirates began prowling across the Mediterranean, the Mamluks were unsuccessful in stopping them, not because the Mamluks weren't good fighters. The Mamluks were remarkable fighters, but they weren't sailors. They weren't maritime people. They did not come from a seafaring people. And that's why the Mamluks had difficulty faring against them. Once they came ashore and it was a ground war, well, then you all know what the result was going to be. But when it came to seafaring adventures, because of the unpredictability of storms, waves, all these other things, learning how to use the astrolabe, that's not what the Mamluks did. The Ottomans were different. Sulaiman al-Awwal built a huge fleet, probably the largest maritime fleet that had ever been known of. Most of the history books mention that they don't even know how many ships he had commissioned. People make reference to him cutting down forests. That's how much wood that he wanted in order to make as many ships as were needed. He wanted them sleek. He wanted them to be fast. He wanted them to be positionally accurate and movable, aerodynamic. He wanted them to be the best. Because when Salim, his father, was in power, Salim al-Awwal, he was thinking about securing the borders of India and spreading further eastward and actually moving into China. And he was just about to do that when he died suddenly at 50 years of age. Sulaiman al-Awwal, he was different. He was actually looking towards Europe. He was looking westward. Totally different from his father. Looking westward, securing the western borders, trying to show back up at Tours, where some of the early Muslims had shown up and been driven back in Vienna. He wanted to show up again. It's Sulaiman that brought Islam on a much deeper level into the Balkans, the area that we're now calling Yugoslavia, which is a fake nation that was made up. There are no Yugoslavian people racially. It was Marshal Tito forcing Muslims, Orthodox Christians from the Croatians and the Serbian Orthodox Church, none of whom get along, to live under one secular empire. And this secular, prosthetic, synthetic, fake country was called Yugoslavia. Although no one could ever find out what Yugoslavian sounded like, because no one spoke it. What does Yugoslavian sound like? Just as much as what does Pakistani sound like? It's the same principle. Big, massive secular nation, try to water down the faith of all the peoples. Now, Sulaiman, he also did something else. He gathered together all of the legal precepts that the Ottomans used, and he wanted them written out in a simple, systematic fashion. This is why it was called Al-Qanuni. Al-Qanuni, the lawgiver, not because he was making laws and legislating, but because he systematized them. He told some of the qadis that were Hanafis to simplify their books. He said, you must simplify these books, or no one will be able to follow this. You have to simplify the books. So they simplified them. Then he took the books from the other three schools, and he wrote out a destur. Destur now, the Arabs are now using it for the word constitution. That's not what destur meant back then. Destur meant ratification. And what he did is each set of laws he wrote in a canonized form. And so every qadi would have detailed knowledge of the Sharia and detailed knowledge of the leftover pieces of Sharia of the Jews and Christians. So if Jews and Christians came into court, or a Jew came into court, for example, on the Passover, he would know why Jewish witnesses wouldn't be there. They're not going to be there on Sukkot, on Passover, on the high holy days, so he wouldn't hold them in contempt if they were due to come to court for a libel issue. He wouldn't hold them in contempt. Why? Because he knew in their bits and pieces of leftover Sharia that they don't come out during those times. On the Sabbath, they wouldn't hold it during those times. Christians on Orthodox holidays, right? It's systematized everything that was understood. Many of the scholars in that time period, and most of the walis, the governors, most of the mayors and other people spoke at least 5 languages. It was something that was just required. You could not be monolingual. You couldn't afford to be monolingual. He also spread the Ottoman Dawla, the Ottoman governance, in a huge way, and made sure to incorporate, because by systematizing everything into a series of books that could just be referred to, he made it actually possible to rule over such a huge amount of people. I mean, any one time he was ruling over perhaps 4 continents. A lot of people will say that the British Empire is the largest empire there ever was. I disagree. I believe the Ottomans were huge. The British Empire, I say, was not the biggest empire because it used its own currency, and you could not become a member or a subject within that empire, no matter how hard you worked, if you did not fit certain classifications, one of them being lack of melanin. If you did not have that, you were not considered a full-fledged citizen. The Ottomans incorporated, whenever they came into an area, they would take on that currency as part of their area. They would use 4, 5, 6 currencies.